it's a small step, at one small step after another, that gets us to that place. I've pondered as I've been studying the life of Miriam, how do you get from where we saw her in Exodus 15 to where we find her in Numbers chapter 12? And as is the case with all of us, it probably did not happen with her in one great fall, as much as just one step away from God at a time. One step of pride at a time. And then she finds herself doing and saying things that in Exodus 15 you would not have imagined possible. And it's a sobering warning for those of us who are older women, have walked with the Lord for a number of years, to remind us that no matter how long you've walked with the Lord, we're not immune to falling. We need this warning, we need this caution. There's a whole change in her spirit. This is a low point in her story. Now, again, the context is they've come out of Egypt, they've come across the Red Sea. From the Red Sea instance where we saw Miriam in Exodus 15, the Israelites went to Mount Sinai, where the law was given. And they spent about a year there. Now they have left Mount Sinai. And one of the first places they came to, we find in Numbers chapter 11, is a town called, a place that was named Kibroth Hattaavah. Now that may not be on your top places to visit, but it's a very significant place in the history of Israel, and it sets the context for what we're going to see in Numbers chapter 12. Numbers 11, the end of Numbers 11, verse 33 tells us, the anger of the Lord was kindled against the people, and the Lord struck down the people with a very great plague. Therefore, the name of that place was called Kibroth Hattaavah. That's a Hebrew phrase that means graves of craving. The people craved. They were discontent with what God had provided. And God buried them. Many of them struck down in the wilderness. Graves of craving. How many of us live so much of our lives at a place that could be called Kibroth Hattaavah? Oh, maybe God doesn't strike us down physically, although that can happen. But emotionally, mentally, spiritually, we get buried in our discontent, our restlessness, our complaining, our unwillingness to be grateful for what God has provided. And it says there, they named the place Kibroth Hattaavah because there they buried the people who had craving. From Kibroth Hattaavah, the people journeyed to Hazeroth. Now, Hazeroth is a place that is about 40 or 45 miles northeast of Mount Sinai. And that's where the people are parked during this incident in Numbers chapter 12. So Numbers 11, we have Kibroth Hattaavah, where the people are buried in these graves of craving. There's this great plague. Numbers chapter 12, we're going to see Miriam's rebellion in this passage. Then the next chapter, which we're not going to look at, Numbers chapter 13, remember the place associated with that chapter is Kadesh Barnea. And that's where the people doubted God, they rebelled against God, and God said, you're going to spend 40 years in this wilderness. Now, if you put those three chapters together, Numbers 11, 12, and 13, I'd say Moses was having some tough days. And sometimes when you are in leadership, there are going to be days back to back, just like these days. And we're going to see not only the woman who instigated this insurrection, this rebellion, but also how the man of God responded in that circumstance. So chapter 12, verse 1, we're at Hazeroth. Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of a Cushite woman whom he had married, for he had married a Cushite woman. Now take just that first phrase. Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses. What was Miriam doing the last time we saw her? She was praising, I will sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and the rider fell into the sea. The Lord, my God, my strength, my song, Yeshua, my salvation. He is my God. And the next thing we see this woman saying is against the servant of the Lord. The verb there, she spoke, they spoke against Moses. It's actually, in the Hebrew language, a feminine singular verb, which implies strongly that Miriam was the instigator and that Aaron was just along for the ride. Now, we know from other passages that Aaron was not a great leader. He was very easily influenced by whoever was around him. And apparently, he's the younger brother. Apparently, he was just following along. He agreed with Miriam, but she was the one who was singled out for punishment when God came and spoke to them because she was the one who instigated this rebellion. In verses 1 and 2, she brings forth, along with Aaron, two complaints. The first one is the obvious surface issue we just read in verse 1. They spoke against Moses because of the Cushite woman whom he had married, for he had married a Cushite woman. Now, we don't know, commentators disagree, and I don't think there's any way to be sure who this woman was. It may have been Zipporah, the Midianite woman that he had married, and there's a way these words are used that she could be the one it's talking about here. Or it may have been that Zipporah had died and Moses had married a second wife. We don't know, but we do know that in either case, this was not a marriage that God had forbidden. In Exodus chapter 34, verses 11 and 16, you read the list of who the Israelites were to marry, and essentially they were not to marry the Canaanite women, because God was going to wipe out the Canaanites and put the Israelites in the land, and God didn't want his people being drawn into the idolatry of the Canaanites. But this woman, whether it was Zipporah or a second wife, was not in the list of forbidden women. So Miriam couldn't say, God told you not to marry this woman. Now, we don't know what the issue was, why Miriam was opposed to this. We can speculate, and that's all we can do. But to this point, Miriam had been probably the major female figure in Israel. 2 to 3 million people. She was the acknowledged leader of the women. She was respected. She was looked up to. And it may have been that she sensed that this Cushite woman posed a threat to her status. This woman, maybe it was a second wife, she would have Moses' ear. And Miriam might lose the influence that she had had on Moses. That Moses might seek out this woman's opinions rather than Miriam's. So perhaps there was a fear of being overshadowed by another woman. In Numbers 11, there's another possible clue. We won't look back in that passage, but you remember that in that passage, Moses' father-in-law suggested that he get some help in ruling Israel, and in Numbers, suggestion was made in Exodus 18, but it was implemented in Numbers 11, where 70 elders were appointed to assist Moses in leading the people. And the idea had been first suggested by Moses' father-in-law. So I wonder if Miriam was feeling that she and Aaron were getting edged out of the leadership of Israel. Now there were going to be a lot of people. The organizational chart was changing. The structure was changing. And I wonder if she felt overlooked or bypassed or neglected. Perhaps she wanted greater recognition, and she saw the competition of these 70 elders who would now have position. Maybe she felt that their rights had been trampled, that their position had been threatened. She seems to be defending some turf. There's a new leadership structure, and she feels that she and Aaron have a right to be consulted on such an important decision as this. Now, this Cushite woman was apparently not the real issue. That may have been the straw that broke the camel's back, or the excuse that Miriam and Aaron were looking for in order to make their beef with Moses public. But it's clear in verse 2 what the real issue was. And this is the second issue that she raises. It's the one that God addresses. Verse 2, and they said, has the Lord indeed spoken only through Moses? Has he not spoken through us also? This appears to be the crux of the issue. The real issue. It's the one that God answers. Now, when we have an issue like this, it's important to ask of the other person and to ask of our own selves when we have the issue, what is going on in the heart? What's the heart issue here? Not just what's the symptom, what's the fruit, what's going on the outside. We know what's going on the outside. She's speaking against Moses. She's raising these criticisms, these objections. But what's going on in her heart? And as I've been meditating on these passages, I think there's several things. First, there's obviously envy and jealousy. Envy and jealousy. Miriam had known Moses since he was in diapers. She was the big sister. And she knew that he'd had this privileged upbringing in the palace. He'd been spared the hardships of slavery. Moses always got the spotlight. And I wonder if there was envy or jealousy in her heart. She was in the shadows. You know, it can be difficult to watch others succeed, especially if it's a sibling. To celebrate the successes of a sibling or someone who's close to you. It reminds me of Joseph's older brothers, as they became jealous of God speaking to him, and they began to attack him and to come against him. That's what I see happening here. Miriam is thinking, I'm a prophet too. The scripture says she was a prophetess. That's a female prophet. Not only is Moses a prophet, I'm a prophet. Yeah, I know God speaks to Moses, but God speaks to us too. We can hear from God. Moses was the youngest sibling, and there's this thing going on in her heart. You're not the only one God speaks to. Who says we have to do what you said? I mean, it sounds like children, doesn't it? You're not the boss. Who said you were in charge? The youth pastor in our church preached on this passage not too long ago as I was just starting to formulate some thoughts and meditate on this passage myself. And let me read to you what he said about this whole issue of envy. He said, when personal envy puts us on the offensive, we no longer see the other person as being made in the image and likeness of God. We lose respect for them as an individual. And now that person becomes an obstacle to our personal happiness. Instead of enjoying them, you begin to despise them. Instead of valuing them, you degrade them. Instead of lifting them up, you boast about yourself. Instead of rejoicing over their giftedness, you downplay their contribution to the kingdom. The insidious, deadly sin of envy and jealousy. Not only wishing that you had what someone else has, but wishing that they didn't have it. Pulling ourselves up in order to push them down. Pushing them down to pull ourselves up. Selfish ambition is obviously an issue in her heart. She wants to be equal with Moses. She wants greater power. We see her striving for position, for authority, for influence. And that selfish ambition produces rivalry. Resentment, perhaps, in her heart, that Moses was getting this great access to God. Perhaps she resented that. The heart of the issue always comes back to pride, doesn't it? Pride, seeking to be exalted, seeking to be preeminent. She was a prophetess, after all. She was respected. She'd been a truth speaker for years. And you know, when God has used us to speak truths into the lives of others, when he's used us as an instrument in the lives of others, we can come to the point where we expect people to agree with everything we say. And I wonder if that's what happened to Miriam. It reminds me of that passage in the third epistle of John, 3 John verse 9, where it talks about a man named Diotrephes. Remember how he was described? It said he likes to put himself first. The New King James Version says there, he loves to have preeminence among them. He wants to be first. And what did it say about him? He likes to be first, and he does not acknowledge our authority. Pride leads to rebellion. Rebellion against authority. And we see that in Miriam's life. Rebelling against God-ordained authority. She's resisting God's place, God's role for her life. She's insisting on having a place or a role that he has designed for someone else. And as a result, she oversteps her role and her place. Now, this is so contrary to what we see of her in Exodus 15. In Exodus 15, we see her affirming Moses' leadership. We see her responding to the leadership of God's man who has been given the responsibility to lead the people. She's responding, she's following, she's affirming leadership. What is she doing now? She's bucking leadership. She's resisting it. She's speaking against Moses and his leadership. We see here a woman who has discontent in her heart. She's discontented with her God-given role, her God-given calling. It was a great gift from God to be a prophetess. But she wanted Moses' job too. She chafed against the position, the prestige, and the prominence that had been given to Moses. One of my heroes in the faith is a heroine, perhaps I should say, is a woman named Dr. Helen Roseveare, who for many years was a missionary surgeon in the Congo, and 1950 to 1970, I think. And she's written a number of wonderful books. If you can get a copy of any of those, you must read them. The one that I've read a number of times over the years is called Living Sacrifice. And let me read to you just a few accounts. She was a single woman missionary. She was a surgeon. She had a lot of training and gifts and theological training. She went and served the Lord in the Congo for many years. And let me give you a glimpse of some of the things she experienced there. At one point, she said, "My right to be considered, to have my opinion listened to give my advice, to make choices and decisions, certainly insofar as these directly related to my own life and the outworking of the vision he had given me, it all seemed so essentially right and reasonable." She said, when the committee of senior missionaries responsible for the overall planning of church ministries in our area of Congo, Zaire, decided to ask me to go to Nebo Bongo to set up the medical center there, I was furious. There was no medical worker on the committee, and I felt at least I should have the right to explain why, to me, this was a very bad decision. She says, when the committee decided that I should go on furlough after only 5 years of service, I was indignant. Why couldn't I do 7 years or more as everyone else did? At least I had the right to be consulted. Would it be convenient to my mother and family for me to go then? She talks about another instance later on in her service. She said 3 others joined the team. There were those who were more qualified than I was in particular areas, and I slowly found that I was not really needed in the team that I had been previously. And this was hard to take. I had always been needed. I suppose my ego thrived on it. Now I was needed chiefly as a glorified office boy. Now here's a woman who was a surgeon, and she found herself doing paperwork in the office. She said, and I was discontented. As usual, the grumble reached the ears of the school committee, including 2 or 3 church elders. So there's this discontent, this pride, this sense that my rights have been overstepped, that I've not been consulted. And we sense this in Miriam's heart. And as Dr. Rosevere's grumbling reached the ears of the authorities, Miriam's grumbling reached the ears of God. We see how this heart expressed itself. The personal gripe turns to public attack. She couldn't let it go. She got this thing in her craw and she held on like a pit bull. Someone said to me once, and it was not intended as a compliment, and it was not taken as a compliment, you know, you can act like a pit bull sometimes. Well, at the time I didn't know what a pit bull was or what they do. I do now. But you've seen pictures or video, and they grab onto something and they will not let it go. They are going to win. And that's how we can be when we get our minds fixed on what we think is our right, our way, our perspective. And Miriam becomes a pit bull. She won't let it go. And what's in her heart starts to come out. It starts to express itself. Now, the people in the previous chapter, Numbers 11, had just experienced a plague where God buried many of them for their whining. You'd think that Miriam would have been scared to whine. But apparently, she and Aaron thought that they could be an exception to God's rule. Apparently, they thought they could get away with it. Why? Because they were leaders. If they didn't think they could get away with it, I don't think they would have done it. They felt that they were above discipline. That even though the people couldn't get away with murmuring and complaining, they could. Now, I have no doubt that she felt that she was justified in her attack. And you know what we do? We make our case in our minds, right? We list all the reasons why we're right. And this may be a debate you're having with your husband or with your the leadership in your church or in the workplace, wherever. And when we come on the attack, we think we're justified. We think we're right. We've thought it all through so logically. She thought her concern was legitimate. Now, God's response indicates that she was wrong, at least in the way she handled her concern. But in this case, it didn't really matter whether Moses was right or wrong in taking this wife. What mattered was the way Miriam handled her objection to his leadership. Inevitably, what's in our hearts is going to come out, as it did in Miriam's case. It surfaces in our words, our attitudes, our actions. How did it come out in Miriam? Well, we see in her a lack of respect for God's designated authority. We see her challenging, undermining Moses' authority. He's not the only one who hears from God. We see her criticizing, speaking against Moses, the servant of the Lord. Now, it seems that first she had spoken against him to other people. And then she ultimately takes that verbal attack to Moses himself. She's trying to diminish his leadership, to diminish his influence. It says Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses. Now, the verb construction in that passage is fascinating, and I'm not a Hebrew scholar. I had some help with this, but once I saw this, I could just picture Miriam in the scene in a whole different way that you don't see with just the English language. First of all, we saw that it's feminine singular, so it's Miriam who's instigating this. It's Miriam who's leading the way in this attack. But also, the construction there, the grammatical construction, is that this is habitual, ongoing action. This is not something she just said once. She was nagging. She wouldn't let it go. She kept bringing it up, kept bringing it up, kept bringing it up. And then here's what I learned about the grammar here as well. It's an intensive type of action. So not only is Miriam doing the leading, and Miriam is she's continuing to talk this way, but she is spewing out verbal attacks. This is an intensive attack. She is shouting. She is railing against Moses, the servant of the Lord. She has totally popped her cork. She has lost it. The lid has blown off the pot. She is steamed, and she's making it known. Now, you just picture this. She is irate. She is angry. She is mad. She is whatever other words you could use there. Compare that woman to the woman we saw in Exodus 15. Praising the Lord, singing songs and psalms. How does she get from that to becoming this angry, violent, vile, contentious woman? Now, I don't think she started out by spewing out these verbal assaults. What happened was that she didn't deal with the heart issues when they first came out, when they first began to surface in her heart. She let them go. She nursed them. She mulled over them. You ever do this? You know, you get offended by your husband or somebody you work with or somebody in your church, and it's just a little thing at first. But you begin to mull it over and think about it, and you go to bed thinking about it, and you lie there at night thinking about it, and it snowballs, and it gets bigger, and it gets bigger, and it gets bigger, and by morning, you are one angry woman. And all of a sudden, this angry stuff is coming out in this intensive, nagging, spewing, this contentious woman. And you look at yourself, and other people look at you and think, who are you and where did you come from? How does it happen? It's important for us to see this in a 90-year-old woman and realize you never get to the place in your walk with God where you are not capable of being really, really ugly. As I taught this for our radio series a few weeks ago, there's Miss Dorothy who always sits on the front row. She's 83 years old. And she loves the Word. She loves the Lord. She's a precious woman. She's a prayer warrior. She prays for revival, has a real heart for the Lord. And as we had some sharing time after this session, she said, God has just shown me that I can't take for granted that I will make it to the finish line as a godly woman. She said, I need to pray that God will give me grace to be faithful till 90 or however long God has for me. That's the heart we need to have as we see this in Miriam. There's disloyalty that comes out. She's gathered support for her position. She and Aaron have obviously talked to each other. And I'll tell you what, if there's something that really, really troubles me when I see it in families and in churches and in ministries, it's this issue of disloyalty. I have watched it again and again. It is so deadly. And not only I've been on both sides of it. I've been under leadership and watched what happens when people become disloyal. I've been in leadership and watched what happens when people become disloyal. It is a deadly sin. And sometimes we have been the cause of it, unwittingly perhaps. But these seeds of disloyalty, as we just talked to one other person, I'm just so concerned about how so-and-so is handling this situation. I was talking recently with a woman who serves in another ministry, and she was telling me about some issues that are going on with the leadership in their ministry and how there are groups of people under that leader who've come together and in meetings actually talked about the things they disagree with in the leadership while the leader's not there. Now, I have no idea whether the leader knows what they're saying, but I've heard this and I've said that is the sign of a downfall of a ministry. It will destroy a ministry. It will destroy your home if you're sharing with your children things about your husband that are disloyal. You've seen, how many of you are pastors' wives? How many of you have seen disloyalty create havoc in your church at one point or another? People saying things, gossip, people spreading rumors. I've been in the middle of a situation recently involving a church where there's actually ended up being a split. And there are issues on both sides. But disloyalty can be something that ends up being very, very destructive. And we need to be so careful that we're not the ones who, even under a spiritual guise, would be fomenting disloyalty. It strikes me as I think about Moses in this situation. Moses was already under attack from the people. I mean, he had been ever since they left Egypt. And in Numbers 11, the people had murmured against Moses. They had been whined again about his leadership. If ever there was a time that Moses needed the encouragement and the support of those who were closest to him, it was now. But instead of lifting up his hands, instead of trying to figure out what they could do to lift his burden, his brother and his sister, the two closest ones to him, added to his burden by opposing and attacking him. And it just seems to me this was so insensitive and harsh and unloving and selfish on their part. If they could have put themselves in Moses' shoes for a moment, and once you've been in the shoes of the leader, I think you become more sensitive about this kind of thing. Those of you who are pastors' wives, you know what it can do to destroy a church, and it breaks your heart when you see it happening. Listen, these men, these leaders, these husbands, these pastors, they have faults. Moses had his faults. They are not God. They make mistakes, but they need us to be their cheerleaders. They need us to encourage them, to strengthen them. I've heard Byron Paulus say that he never has a bad day and night at the same time, because if he has a bad day in the ministry, he goes home and his wife Sue is there to encourage and lift up his hands. That's the kind of wife God wants you to be to your husband. Whether your husband is the pastor or not, and particularly if your husband is the pastor, he's got plenty of people criticizing him. He needs a wife who will be his encourager. Now, I'm not saying you push sin under the carpet. If there's sin, it needs to be dealt with. But we need to be so, so careful about anything that would sow seeds of disloyalty among the people of God. It's so easy for us as women to feel justified in speaking our mind, in criticizing how men run or don't run things around us, in the home or in the church. I was speaking not too long ago with a women's ministry director in a large church, and she has a heart for the Lord. She's leading those women in some wonderful ways, but she began to share with me how burdened she was that the men, the pastors in their church, do not support the women's ministries in the ways that she feels they need the support. Now, I'm not saying she may be assessing the situation accurately, but I could just hear this shrill tone as she was sharing this with me. A little red flag popped up in my heart as she was saying, these men, watch what you say about these men. Now, those men may need her to go as a helper and to, in a spirit of humility and meekness, share with them what's on her heart. But if she does it with pride, if she does it with a critical spirit, if she says it to others, she's going to be planting seeds of disloyalty. And she's going to end up becoming a Miriam and having an insurrection or rebellion. We'll look in verse 3 at how Moses responds to this attack. Excuse me. Verse 3, now the man Moses was very meek, more than all people who were on the face of the earth. What a contrast to Miriam. Miriam is speaking against Moses. She's anything but meek. But Moses is meek. And the evidence of Moses' humility in this passage is that you never see him defending himself against the attack. He lets God defend him. And God does defend him. Moses doesn't retaliate. In fact, there's no evidence in this passage of him responding verbally at all, except later in the passage to pray for Miriam. He holds his peace. It's a tough thing to do, but he's meek in that situation. And then we see God's response. Verse 2, and the Lord heard it. God took this seriously. He calls Miriam and Aaron to give account in verses 4 and 5 because ultimately their issue was not with Moses, but their issue was with God. Verse 4, and suddenly the Lord said to Moses and to Aaron and Miriam, "Come out, you three, to the tent of meeting." And the three of them came out. And the Lord came down in a pillar of cloud and stood at the entrance of the tent and called Aaron and Miriam, and they both came forward. And he said, "Hear my words. If there is a prophet among you, I, the Lord, make myself known to him in a vision. I speak with him in a dream. Not so with my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my house. With him I speak mouth to mouth, clearly and not in riddles, and he beholds the form of the Lord. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses?" So God defends Moses. Moses didn't have to defend himself. And God confronts and rebukes Miriam and Aaron. God says, "You should have been terrified to speak against my servant." Now, there were some pretty serious consequences that followed, beginning in verse 9. The anger of the Lord was kindled against them, and he departed. You think that the sin of one woman, the mouth of one woman, the disloyalty of one woman, the pride of one woman, the envy and the jealousy, the competitive spirit of one woman, the contentious spirit of one woman, the gossip of one woman can cause the presence of God to leave.